Tonight on Scripps Newsline, if you are always pinching pennies until payday or picking and choosing which bills to pay every month, you are not alone.
A 3-bedroom is like $2,200 a month.
New data confirms what a lot of you already know all too well. America's families are struggling, and its middle class is disappearing.
We're always like a paycheck away from losing it all.
How did Americans go from thriving on one income to barely scraping by with two? And later this hour, the wealth gap widens. As more families fall through the financial cracks, a handful of the ultra-rich race towards a new monetary milestone, trillionaire status. Scripps Newsline begins right now. Hello and welcome. I am Lauren Magarino. This is Scripps Newsline, a brand new show here on Scripps News where we explore stories that matter to you with in-depth conversations and storytelling. Today, we are hitting you in your pocketbook. Decades ago, middle-class America looked something like this: a steady income from a stable job, home ownership, the ability to get and save assets. But now, that version of the American dream is out of reach for so many. The middle class as we once knew it is seemingly shrinking, dwindling, really, away. Just take a look at this data from the Pew Research Center. Researchers say the share of U.S. adults who live in middle-class households fell from 61% in 1971 to 50% in 2021. And the number of Americans who consider themselves in the lower income bracket jumped to nearly 30%. So why are so many more Americans living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to make ends meet? Scripps News national correspondent Amber Strong shares the story of one mother asking those very same questions.
Many Americans say they are struggling to pay the bills, living paycheck to paycheck, and that includes more than 60% of the American middle class.
As you can see, like after school snacks and times where people are really needing like things that are quick meals.
Things are busy at this Northern Virginia food pantry. January Coates, who helps with the operations here, shows us some of the necessities it stocks for families.
We get yogurt, we get non-perishables, we get snacks, fresh veggies, hygienics, toiletries.
Coates says the pantry serves a variety of people: the elderly, the disabled, and to the surprise of some, middle-class families making between $50,000 and $120,000 a year.
Because Northern Virginia, you're not paying no less than like $1,900 a month for your place. So by the time you add in food costs between the two, you're already out like $3,500 to $4,500.
Olivia Simmons is one of those visitors, a public school employee who says she always puts her students first, even when she doesn't have money to spare.
A lot of these kids, they know me, but I'm in high school, so they're always like, Miss Simmons, do you have a snack? Do you have something to drink?
At home, she's a mom taking care of her family, including a daughter with autism and a husband who suffers from mental illness.
We're just like barely staying afloat. We're always like a paycheck away from losing it all.
The food here helps Simmons stretch her budget, especially considering the rising cost of housing in the area.
I'm paying $1,840 a month now for a 2-bedroom. Apartment. Apartment. You know what I'm saying? And then a 3-bedroom is like $2,200 a month.
According to a report from Lending Club and Payments, about 65% of people earning between $50,000 and $100,000 annually say they live paycheck to paycheck, struggling to pay the bills.
If you live paycheck to paycheck, almost by definition, you're not middle class. Because you don't have enough to save.
Most Americans agree in order to truly feel middle class, people say they need the ability to pay the bills, pay a $1,000 emergency expense without adding debt, go on vacation, retire comfortably, and save, according to a survey from the Washington Post. Iana Spiridopoulos, an assistant professor of finance at American University, says the ability to do all those things goes beyond the basic definition of middle class, which is making 2/3 of the national median household income. It varies by family size, where you live, debt, and job security.
When automation comes, and some of those jobs are getting replaced by machines, puts them in a position where they don't have that security, so they lose their jobs, and combined with any form of debt that you may have, that's going to, of course, put you in a very difficult position.
And while inflation has cooled, housing and food prices remain higher than before the pandemic, leaving some middle-class households stuck in the middle, making too little to keep up with cost and too much for government assistance programs.
I think that we need to have more policies to help make the housing market lower for people like us.
In the meantime, Simmons says she's still hopeful about the future.
Life is short, and so we're still fed. We're not going to bed starved. You know what I mean? If it's rice and beans, then we'll eat rice and beans. It just is what it is, and we make it work.
Amber Strong, Scripps News, Annandale, Virginia.
The story is one shared by millions of Americans stuck in the middle. So what can you do to break the paycheck to paycheck cycle? Let's talk about it with Emory University finance professor Tom Smith. His specialties include unemployment and inflation. Thank you so much for joining us. How would you describe the state of the American middle class?
Well, actually, I like the little clip that you just showed. And I think that it shows that people who have enough means to get by are finding it very difficult to do much more than that. And I think it's definitely becoming a challenge for people to try to move farther than maybe their parents did, right? Especially if housing prices are keeping them from maybe achieving the American dream of owning a house. So I liked a lot of the things that you had in that clip.
Okay. I was going to say, what are the challenges in your view? And housing, clearly off the top of your mind, is number one. What's 2 and 3?
Well, I think housing is number one because we did see the huge escalation in the cost of housing coming out of COVID, and mortgage rates are much higher than they were during COVID. I think 2 and 3 probably are food costs. I was gonna say energy costs, but energy costs are actually down. They've been fairly constrained, and inflation on energy, gas prices, the like, have actually been pretty low. So maybe 3 is just the day-to-day kind of living in terms of, are you going to engage in some kind of entertainment? You're going to go to the movies. You're going to take your family to Six Flags type of a situation, or go on a vacation. I know that those things aren't necessities, but as you mentioned, those are the kind of activities that people like to move towards. That's what their goals are towards the middle of the summer, or the end of a school year or something. So, those are very, very difficult to achieve right now because costs are going up.
We see the costs that we talked about, and we know wages have mostly stagnated. And the BBC recently reported in some cases, wages are falling, with employers saying that compensation is just, quote, resetting. How true is that?
No, that's a very, very good point. I've had my students actually calculating these things in the classroom, so it's an incredibly valuable wages, which is just the paycheck that you get. They have been increasing, and they increased during COVID, but inflation was actually outpacing the increase in wages. So your real buying power has been falling. And as you mentioned, it's been stagnant as of late. One of the calculations that I did prior to coming on was looking at, if wages had stayed at the same rate of increase prior to COVID, most families, like an average family, would probably be earning something of about $25,000 to maybe $3,000 more than they currently are. Right. So we did see some wages go down, and we've seen inflation going up. So real buying power went down as now being relatively constant. I think that that's putting a lot of people in a position where they're saying, the economy is moving forward without me. What do I have to do to catch up?
Yeah. And, one of the things that I remember, and especially with the pandemic that we saw play out, were unions and kind of the, wave of strikes that we saw play out. In 2023, 10% of U.S. workers were in a union. That's down from just over 20% since 1983. That's according to Pew Research. How do unions factor into the middle class's ability to roar back, if you will?
That's a pretty good point you're making here. Actually, we did see some increase in unionization probably since 2020, maybe even 2021, and we saw some unionization taking place recently in Tennessee with this Volkswagen plant. We've seen unions striking with the big three automakers up in Detroit and getting an increase in wages. Once upon a time, the middle class America, if you will, were blue collar workers working at your Ford, working at GE's, working at UPS, working 40 hours plus overtime, having union benefits. That really went away, starting in the 80s and really dropping down. I think that's starting to make a comeback. I mean, we're seeing more unionization, and we're seeing, at least last 2 years, we saw more strikes and unions trying to get back some of that power. But still, we're a far way away, as your graphic just showed, from the strong union state that we had, in the late 60s, early 70s.
All right, I got one more question for you. What would it take to resuscitate, if you will, the middle class that Americans, remember, what it used to be like?
That's a really great question. I think a lot of people might have to, unfortunately, reset expectations about what it means to be middle class and what it is that they have to, like what it is that they need to accomplish, right? I mean, if you can get into a house, if you can afford that mortgage right now, if you can work hard and try to live that American dream, maybe you're going to say, okay, well, maybe we can't go on vacation every year. Maybe we're going to have to go on vacation every other year, right? Maybe we're going to have to send our kids to public schools instead of, one of the church schools around the neighborhood. I mean, the truth is that the economy is constantly growing, and we have to constantly reevaluate where we are in the economy. And I think we're at a place in time where people have to do a reassessment. And unfortunately, although the economy is growing, it is leaving some people behind. So I think a reset is probably in the mind of what a middle class person thinks that they need in order to move forward.
Professor Tom Smith with Emory University, thank you so much for your time and your insight tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate it.
Now, coming up, as the American middle class evolves, you're hearing about, reset potentially. The classic vision of the American dream is getting blurrier for many. Author Alyssa Court is waiting in the wings to talk with us about where that dream went wrong and why she says we should liberate ourselves from those expectations. Our conversation is straight ahead.